Now that we know how to process JSON data, in this mini video we're going to explore how JavaScript can request and receive data of that format from a server. In particular, we're going to explore how to do this using the Ajax family of web technologies. Here, asynchronous JavaScript just means it's running in the background. You don't have to reload the page to request this data. And while X stands for XML, in practice you can exchange data using text or JSON instead. Ultimately, the data exchange happens via a special built-in object called XMLHttpRequest, and this is what I'm going to be showing you in the video today. We're going to be using the same example as the previous video, but instead of hard coding the JSON as a string, what we're going to be doing is requesting it from a PHP file that dynamically generates it, Britons.php. I'm going to begin by defining a function called getBrits, which is ultimately going to be requesting this JSON data, and then I want to make sure that this function is called once when the document is loaded. The very first thing I need to do is create an XMLHttpRequest object. This is this special built-in object provided by the browser that allows us to exchange data behind the scenes. Next, we assign a function to the onReadyStateChange property of the object. Intuitively, the browser will trigger this function whenever the status of the request changes and whenever a response is received from the server. I'm going to leave the body of the function blank for the moment and come back to it later. What I'm going to do in the meantime is use the open and send methods to set up an HTTP GET request to this Britons.php file. This third argument, by the way, true, just indicates that we want this request to happen asynchronously in the background. Okay, now that the request is set up, let's go back to the function we need to define to handle the response. Now remember that I mentioned that this function is triggered whenever the status of the request changes. Confusingly, this happens 4 times, as shown in this screenshot here. The only status change that we're really interested in for this example is status change 4, once the request is finished and a response is ready. At this point, we're also interested in the status code of the response. We want to make sure that it's status code 200 for OK, as opposed to something like an error 404. Okay, so in the body of this function, I'm going to check that the request is completed and that the status of the response is OK. Note here that the variable this refers to the XMLHttpRequest object. Provided these conditions are met, I'm going to write to the console the value of the response text property which contains the response from the server. And as you can see, it's this JSON data that we were expecting all along. Like last time, we can convert this JSON string into an object using JSON.parse and then access the array via the Britons property. In order to process the array and create the unordered list, I'm going to be a little bit lazy and copy and paste the code from the previous video. The only addition I want to make is to wipe out the contents of the UL element to make sure the list is reset whenever getBrit is called. And there we go. We re-implemented the example of the previous video, but instead of using a hard-coded JSON string, we've requested it from a PHP script using Ajax technology. To finish off this example, I'd like to be able to add a new Brit to the data store of this PHP script, and I'd like to be able to request this again using Ajax technology. So let me just uncomment these input elements that I added a little bit earlier, and then set up an event listener for the button that triggers a function called addBrit. The first thing I need to do is create an object for this new Brit, and I'm going to extract the values that were entered in these input elements. Once the object is created, I need to convert it into a JSON string ready to send to the server, and we can write it to the console to see what a particular example looks like. Okay, I'm going to copy this JSON string and show you how it can be passed to this PHP script to create a new Brit. In this video, I'm not interested in the implementation of this PHP script, but rather I just want to show you that if we pass this JSON string as the value of the new Brit parameter, this new Brit is created and added to the data store. Okay, so let's do that GET request automatically using an XMLHttpRequest object and passing the JSON representation of the new Brit in the query string. Okay, so when I enter in a new Brit and hit submit, the request is made. The PHP script on the server receives the JSON representation of the new Brit, and then it's processed and added to the data store. As soon as I refresh the page, I see it. Just to make this process a little more interactive, I'm going to update the function assigned to the onReadyStateChange property. And once a successful response is received, I'm going to create a pop-up box, and then I'm going to call the getBrits function to refresh the list and show the new entry. Now, just to finish off, what you might remember from IS216 is that if we're sending user input to a server, we typically do this with a POST request, not a GET request. This requires just a little bit of modification. We have to specify the data in the send method instead, and we need to add an HTTP header so that the server knows what to expect. And that's it for this mini video. We introduced the Ajax family of web technologies, allowing your browser to send and receive data in the background and to dynamically update the page without reloading. We showed how it's implemented in JavaScript via this built-in XMLHttpRequest object, where you had to define your own function to handle the response. We showed how you can receive JSON from a server using a GET request. And finally, we showed you how to send JSON to a server using a POST request. See you next time.